Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Romanecki, President and CEO of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the keynote lecture for Roy Lichtenstein, Monet's Garden Goes Pop. While I wish we were together to celebrate this next installment in the Jean and Alfred Goldstein exhibition series, it is wonderful to see such a great virtual turnout. You hear me say this every year, but truly this may be our best exhibition yet. If you have not yet seen the exhibition, I encourage you to come and visit soon. It's my pleasure to thank our sponsor for today's lecture, the law firm of Williams, Parker, Harrison, Dietz, and Getson. We will now hear from Mike Wilson, a partner at the firm and also a member of Selby Gardens Board of Trustees. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Mike Wilson, and I'm a partner and member of the management committee at Williams Parker, which has had its roots here in Sarasota now for nearly 100 years. This past year has certainly been a challenging year and an extraordinary one, and has given us all a greater appreciation of the arts, culture, and natural beauty that Sarasota has to offer. It's truly our honor and privilege to continue to partner with Selby Gardens and once again support this keynote lecture for the Jean and Alfred Goldstein exhibition series. Each year, Selby seems to outdo themselves, and this year is no exception. Roy Lichtenstein's Monet Gardens Goes Pop exhibition is no exception. Many thanks to Dr. Carol Ockman, Curator at Large at Selby Gardens, for putting together another phenomenal exhibit. Dr. Ockman is the Robert Sterling Clark Professor of Art History Emerita at Williams College, and it is my pleasure to introduce her this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ockman.
Thank you, Mike, for that gracious introduction. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to my inaugural Zoom lecture. I'd like to thank our visionary president and CEO for all things Selby, including our rich partnership, the entire Selby team, and especially my co-conspirators in the museum, Jeannie Perales and Laura Avery, and Mike McLaughlin and Angel Lara in horticulture. As always, I'm deeply indebted to Jean Goldstein and the late Alfred Goldstein and all the lenders and donors who made this show possible this year under extreme duress. I want to acknowledge our outstanding research assistant and intern for this exhibition, Lisa Zhang, and Luis Guevara Flores, and I wish to thank Peggy Waller, my partner in all things. Finally, I'd like to dedicate this lecture to Robert L. Herbert, my thesis advisor and pioneering art historian of Impressionism, who died in December. Pop icon Roy Lichtenstein and Impressionist avatar Claude Monet. Whose idea was this? Don't look at me, or Jennifer, or Jeannie, or Mike, or Angel, or anyone at Selby. It was Lichtenstein. Some of you know his work. Indeed, it's hard not to. Next slides. But you may not be aware that in 1968, he does Monet next. And not just any old Monet, even if there were such a thing anymore, but his most famous works, the series he did at Giverny. Next slide. 25 years later, in 1992, Lichtenstein went back and did the water lilies. We have brought the haystacks and water lilies to our garden. Next. Thanks to the generosity of collections and collectors in Florida and further afield. And on the screen, you see one of the haystacks and one of the water lilies in the exhibition, and our fanciful haystack vignette near the Great Lawn. In my lecture today, I'm going to show you how Lichtenstein got to Monet, next, and why. lest you're skeptical that these two artists share anything. I'm going to show and tell you some things you wouldn't see or hear otherwise. I hope to convince you not only that these two unlikely bedfellows are connected, but also that Lichtenstein measures up to Monet, that he was as groundbreaking in his time as his illustrious precursor, and finally, that what both artists do through their series is to deepen the practice of seeing. Next. By the time Lichtenstein made his first manufactured Monets, as he called them, next, he was already famous for his comic and advertising-inspired works and an integral member of the pop pantheon, featuring from left to right, on the right screen, Claes Oldenburg, Tom Wesselmann, Lichtenstein, Jean Shrimpton, James Rosenquist, and Andy Warhol. And here's what some of these were doing at that time. May I have the next? Warhol's Flowers, which you saw in our exhibition a couple of years ago on the left, Oldenburg's Double Cheeseburger, and next Rosenquist, his flower garden on the left, and the advertising source on the right. Next, please. Lichtenstein's early pop works didn't spring fully blown from the head of Zeus like Athena, although the artist already had modernist inclinations as a student, as we see in the Cubist-inspired Indians Pursued by American Dragoons on the left, which bespeaks as well a modernist interest in things Native American. He came to abstract expressionism, as you see on the right, relatively late in the second half of the 1950s. Next. In the spring-summer 1961, Lichtenstein made his break into cartoon subjects, some of which were inspired by the images inside bubblegum wrappers, as you see on the right, and Popeye on the left. The story goes like this. When Lichtenstein was teaching at Douglas College in New Jersey, his colleague, Alan Capro, creator of The Happening, took bazooka bubblegum wrappers from Lichtenstein's young sons, David and Mitchell. Could I have the next? And here you see Lichtenstein carousing. The colleague of Lichtenstein said to the future pop wizard, showing him a gum wrapper, "You can't teach color from Cézanne. You can only teach it from something like this," a statement with which this art historian, by the way, doesn't actually agree. But here's the punchline. Next, please. In response, Lichtenstein showed him an abstract painting with Donald Duck in it, and shortly afterwards, he would make an image like Look Mickey on the screen. Next. Transmuting popular sources into high art paintings was a radical move. It created an unresolved duality, as James Rondo put it, between imagery that was not esteemed and high art, which it became when Lichtenstein inscribed it in painting or prints. What makes that move, that unresolved duality, more powerful still is Lichtenstein's simulation of their commercial technique. He drains the particularity from each image or object and thus makes it his own. Like much pop production of the second half of the 20th century, both his content and style constitute a break with both European painting and American painting before it. What he creates contemporaneously with Warhol is an art based on a culture of reproduction, to use Calvin Tompkins' phrase. Next. Although drawn from commercial imagery, Lichtenstein's style, and to a certain extent his content, is unique. He juxtaposes flat zones of color to dotted ones, which imitate Ben-Day dots in printing, repeating diagonal lines and thick black outlines as well. His earliest pop works hew to a palette of 4 colors: purplish blue, a lemon yellow, a medium red, an occasional green, which we do not have here, plus black and white. And that's Kiss 5 and a drawing for pop on the right. Next. The first 2 series of Monet-inspired works, the Roon Cathedrals, one of which you see on the left, and the haystacks on the right of 1968-69, in fact, consist only of blue, yellow, and red, along with black and white, regardless of the similarities or continuities with his first pop works. These works are a far cry from comics and everyday objects. What prompted them? Well, for one, it's important to know, next please, Lichtenstein had already made a number of pop landscapes, and that the ones he chose to make repeated something that was well known, popular, even a cliche. So you have sunrise on the left and setting sun on the right. Next. Here we have a common denominator, albeit a surprising one. Lichtenstein's Picassos and Mondrians on the screen are also drawn from well-known, popular, even cliched images. As the pop interpreter himself explains, Picasso has become a kind of popular object. One has the feeling that there should be a reproduction of Picasso in every home, end quote. In fact, Lichtenstein avers that the criterion for choosing imagery for his work in general is that the image has become public and clear and conceptualized. Next. This is as true as Lichtenstein's Picassos and Mondrians as it is of his Van Goghs or purist compositions of the early 20th century. Next. Given how iconic Lichtenstein and pop art have become, it's hard to imagine the initial reception of his early paradigm-shifting pop works like Drowning Girl or Art. But by making everything generic, his subject matter was deemed meaningless. Viewers were shocked by the ironic distance between the style and the emotional content of the works. Many thought these pop works went beyond the limits of bad taste. Next. Fascinatingly, when Lichtenstein temporarily left behind comics and consumer goods to do versions of Picasso, Mondrian, and Monet, that hostility melted away. Lest you think Lichtenstein's privileging of form over content might also erase politics from his work. Stay with me. And Yellow Haystack in the exhibition, plus a Lichtenstein Mondrian on the right. It seems to me no coincidence that Lichtenstein made his first Monet-inspired works in the spring and summer of 1968. Next, please. In other words, at the very moment of 1968, May 1968, in fact, a time of dramatic political upheaval, both at home and abroad, Lichtenstein turned to Monet, whose status as a kind of French national hero, even during his lifetime, was unmistakable. Indeed, well before Monet began his series works, he was jockeying to retain Impressionism as a distinctly French style. May I have the next? And this was in the face of competition from upstarts like Seurat, whose Sunday Afternoon at the Grand Jatte you see on the left, and Gauguin's Day of the Gods that you see on the right. Next, please. As Paul Hayes Tucker compellingly argues, Monet's first series paintings at Giverny addressed the heritage of France, from its agrarian fecundity, exemplified in the grain stacks, which you see on the right, whose source near Monet's property at Giverny you see in an historic photograph in the exhibition. And that moves as well to its technologically prescient and enduring monuments. So that's how the heritage of France is seen. Could I have the next? And this is embodied in the engineering feats of Gothic cathedrals, specifically in his work, Roon Cathedral, which you see in a historic photograph on the left, and in the Ringling Museum's version of Lichtenstein's screen print. So Monet was not only responding to challenges to his artistic primacy by allying himself with the French nation, but also to the rise of anarchism and worker unrest in the early 1890s, with which artists like Seurat and his followers were allied. Next. given that Monet was commissioned late in his life by the President of the Republic of France to make a cycle of water lilies for the Orangerie, it is clear that his gambit worked, and here are two of the paintings. Yet Monet's move to Giverny, the furthest he'd ever lived from the epicenter of artistic activity, and his creation of a self-contained paradise of his own making there, chart a surprising trajectory for the painter. And here on the screen, we see Monet in his garden and the water pond in historic photographs that are in the exhibition. So it's a striking arrival, if you will, at these kinds of images that were his sources for his paintings, from what he had done earlier, which included 17 paintings of the Gare Saint-Lazare, next, one of Paris's new railroad stations. So Gare Saint-Lazare on the right, and a Water Lilies of 1905 on the left. That move from the industrial and the technological to the paradisical, if you will, not only engages long live debates between city versus country, but also raises questions about the relationship between style and politics. Having given some historical context to Monet's early series, let me turn now to Lichtenstein's next. At the exact time Lichtenstein began his haystacks, the pop artist designed the first of his covers for Time magazine, which appears in the May 24th, 1968 issue. Most of you will recognize Bobby Kennedy, who would be shot to death 2 weeks later, 8 weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Next. Lichtenstein's second cover, The Gun in America, appears June 21st, 1968. It derives from Pistol, a felt banner he made in 1964 on the right, now in the Museum of Modern Arts collection in New York. It may well be true, as one scholar has suggested, the escalation of the Vietnam War around 1964 led Lichtenstein to increase his output of violent images next. But it is just as likely that violence inhered in US life. And on the screen are works from 1964, Sweet Dreams, Baby, and from 65, Atom Burst. But earlier, could I have the next? He had already done Blam, 1962, and Scared Witless the same year. So it's likely that violence inhered in US life and in the comic book imagery that Lichtenstein sourced. Next. Like his Roon Cathedrals, Lichtenstein's Haystack series from May, June 1968 begins with acid yellow dots and ends in darkness with blue and black ones. The artist tells us that he used red and yellow for daylight, but next, when he added blue or purplish dots, as you see here, to red or blue, it was for evening. Finally, and the next, black on blue was for midnight, as you see it on the right. Lichtenstein created full-scale black and white drawings next, which he used to recreate the images on plates. And I'm showing drawing for landscape and a similar screen print, the sunrise, which we saw earlier. A negative of the drawing was laid over Lichtenstein's Ben-Day dot stencil on sensitized plates, recreating the positive pattern in the plate below when exposed to light. By the way, Ben-Day dots, named after the inventor Benjamin Day, provide shading and color tints in printing. Next. Early on, he fabricated an easel that enabled him to rotate whatever he was working on. A traditional maker, he was not. Dots are the primary building block in the double haystacks. Could I have the next? As the series progresses, the dots become more and more dense, recalling the vibrations of art on the one hand, And here you see a black and white double haystack on the left with Bridget Riley's Fission of 1963. So at the same time that they become difficult to read and seem to vibrate like hop art, they also move from a readable image to near abstraction, on the other hand. According to Lichtenstein, the dots in these works are like a quick, cheap impressionism. And he goes further. The cathedrals are meant to be manufactured Monets, and so are the haystacks. On the left, double haystacks in our exhibition, a Roon Cathedral by Lichtenstein, and finally, Monet from the 1894 series. Yet, and Lichtenstein's irony is not lost on me here, while he substitutes an industrial way of making an impressionism, one that denies the great impressionist's hand, for Monet's famously personalized brushstrokes, Lichtenstein produces many of the same effects we find in his antecedents' works, as he himself describes these early Monet-inspired works. You get up close and can't tell what it is. You step back and you see it, end quote. And despite his machine-like technique, Lichtenstein observes, quote, it probably takes me 10 times as long to do one of the cathedral or haystack paintings as it took Monet to do his, end quote. Furthermore, both artists work simultaneously on the group comprising the series so as to be able to deal with them as a whole. Interestingly, when Lichtenstein made his second series of haystacks, also inspired by Monet's compositions, next, he gives primacy to flat planes of color, as you see in the single haystack in our exhibition on the left, and Monet's haystack, actually now called grain stack, winter effect. Here too, Lichtenstein denies the gestural brushwork of his predecessor in favor of the industrial, while creating a completely different look and feel to the series. Next. It is also worth noting that Monet's late water lilies are the closest he ever came to abstraction, and that without Lichtenstein's reference to his forebear's work, his Monet-inspired prints would be the closest he ever came to abstraction as well. So here is one of the water lilies from the Perez Museum in our exhibition, and one of Monet's water lily paintings. In considering Lichtenstein's turn to Monet, it's helpful to know that he'd been to France. First, when he served overseas in the army from 1943 to 1946. Both of these photographs are in our exhibition, the one on the left where he's in front of the Eiffel Tower, the one on the right from the time he returned in 1965 to open his exhibition at the Iliana Sonnabend Gallery in Paris, sitting on an archetypal French balcony. Next. We know that he visited both Giverny and the Orangerie twice. And I'm showing you Giverny in a 1970 photo by Stephen Shore on the left, and a photo of the Orangerie installation on the right. The definitive spark for Lichtenstein's manufactured Monets, however, was without question the landmark exhibition on serial imagery he saw in Pasadena, California in 1968. There he not only viewed works by Mondrian, and these are Mondrian's, not Lichtenstein, compositions in yellow and blue, 1922 and 29. He would have seen works like these by Warhol next, the Campbell soup cans, and of course works by their forerunner Monet next. But he also encountered what would become key definitions of seriality. Here's one from the catalog by prominent photographer and curator John Coplands that conveys the gist of them. Serial imagery is a type of repeated form or structure shared equally by each work in a group of related works made by one artist. Furthermore, serial imagery is concerned with the notion of process, not the masterpiece, a problematic term in any case. Indeed, Monet is the first artist to have seriously worked in series. Since there are multiple haystacks, poplars, bridges on the Thames, water lilies, etc., it's been argued that he negated the very idea of the unique masterpiece, but not so fast. Not so fast, except in rare instances, Monet's series paintings were not kept together. In other words, when exhibited as a series during his lifetime, the paintings were sold individually, thus reinstating the idea of the unique work of art. Next, there's an irony then in Lichtenstein's insistence that at least 3 works from each of his series be sold together. The originals, by which I mean Monet's paintings, were more saleable, more commercial than the reproductions, by which I mean Lichtenstein's screen prints. And on the screen, 3 Liechtenstein water lilies with Japanese bridge. The one on the left from a private collection is in our exhibition. The very specificity of works in series requires a special kind of looking. Do they make the things they depict look more different or more similar? Does the repetition in format and structure bring out small nuances in each work, or deaden the meaning through the sameness of reproduction? Next. When we look at Monet's series, the enormous variations of stroke and color from one work to the next immediately shut down the possibility of deadening. Indeed, the embodiment of his personality through his touch, his auratic status, if you will, greatly contributes to the allure of Monet's series, as you see it in his own version of Water Lilies with Japanese Bridge. Next. It seems impossible to say the same of Lichtenstein. Isn't his industrial technique, with its willful insistence on reproduction, intended to eschew individuality? It can hardly be disputed that the absence of personal touch is one of Lichtenstein's and pop art's key departures from Monet and modernist practice. Next. We might even bring biography into this. As one critic put it, a combination of authority and ironic distance characterizes both Lichtenstein's life and work. Even close friends say they didn't know him very well. The artist himself has remarked that he had no real life outside the studio. The Liechtenstein persona, at least the public one, is a detached one. And here you see him in a color photograph by Andy Warhol on the left, and on the right in Southampton on the beach, where he had both a home and a studio. Next. For an artist whose hand we see rarely, it is a coup to be able to exhibit a preparatory drawing for Water Lilies with Japanese Bridge. And you see it on the left. It's very small, and the very large screen print in the exhibition on the right. It gives us access to his process, or at least its inception. Lichtenstein, after making this preparatory sketch, enlarges the drawing, tightens the composition, eliminates superfluous details, brightens hues, intensifies contrasts, flattens the space, and heightens the codes of commercially printed imagery. Furthermore, I'm especially pleased to have the drawing here because drawings by iconic artists are hard to procure precisely because of their uniqueness and fragility. So a special thank you for that. Next. But let's return to seriality and notions of repetition and process. Can there be a relationship between them? If Monet's lodestar depends on process, a kind of personal evolution, if you will, from canvas to canvas, might Lichtenstein be a deadening serial repeater? There are elements that contravene such a crisp binary opposition between the two artists. For one, Lichtenstein's prints are each original works of art. Next, like Warhol's, there are silk screens, and you see Lichtenstein's water lily on the left and one of Warhol's flowers that was in our exhibition, Warhol Flowers in the Factory. So like Warhol's, these are silk screens by Lichtenstein, but they differ from this other pop legend's work because of the painstaking craftsmanship Lichtenstein and his printers devote to them. Next. And on the top left, you see Lichtenstein making a stencil. In the middle top, holding aloft a very diaphanous screen for applying dots in front of his manufactured Picassos. On the right, someone in the studio inking the stencil, and below on the left, the print press, and finally on the right, revealing the final print. As Lichtenstein himself said of working with Gemini Print Lab in Los Angeles, there are very few places where you can make a mark and have 15 people work on it, end quote. The artist signs off on every individual print. Additionally, who is to say that an artist who chooses to make work that does not privilege personal touch is not as creative as one who does? Next. Mondrian, by the way, faced the same issue. These are the kinds of questions I hope you will bring to the exhibition when you look at Lichtenstein's works, like these. In turning now to his Water Lily series and the works leading up to them, I hope to convince you that process is fully as important to Lichtenstein as it was to Monet. Much happened between 1969, when Lichtenstein completed his haystacks, and 1993, when he completed the Water Lilies. He had always experimented to the max with materials and was endlessly prolific. During those years, next, the artist worked in foundries, and you see his brushstrokes at the Getty on the right, and his brushstroke chair and ottoman on the left. He worked also in ceramics. Next, please. And in metal fabrication, his lily plates on the left, and his goldfish bowl #2 on the right. Print on cloth, could I have the next? His untitled shirt, and also in tapestries, paint, and enamel. Next. Within this extraordinary versatility were two preoccupations that anticipate Lichtenstein's Water Lilies. The first is his interest in reflections, which you see in his mirror series of the 1970s on the screen. It's fascinating to reflect, pun intended, that Lichtenstein's overlay of reflection upon reflection interferes with seeing the complete image, the way familiarity interferes with seeing a complete picture, as one scholar puts it. We recognize them as mirrors because we know what they are from the title. It's much the same with Cubist works. Next. 20 years later, Lichtenstein made a series of large interiors which contain mirrors and other reflecting surfaces, as well as artworks. So on the left, you have interior with mobile, and you see the Alexander Calder work in the bottom left. On the right, interior with mirrored closet, which enables us to see the bed reflected, and also a corner of it in the actual space. Next. But the artist's earliest images with reflections go back to the mid-1960s. On the left is Girl in Mirror, executed in porcelain enamel on steel. And on the right, Moonscape, which employs, as do many of Lichtenstein's landscapes from this time, Rolux, a thermoplastic film that is able to simulate depth and motion through light. It produces a range of optical effects, including shimmering, which you see here on the right, bubbles, flames, which you can see a little bit here, and sparkles. Next, you will experience these, in fact, in our pond in the conservatory on the left screen. Next. The second long-standing preoccupation leading to Lichtenstein's Water Lilies is his desire to make the ephemeral permanent. Explosions are a leitmotif in early works like Blam of 1962, and in the porcelain enamel on steel sculpture entitled Standing Explosion of 1965. Lichtenstein's romance, if you will, with reflections and explosives, is part of his predilection to do things we might think his style cannot achieve. To these, we can add the gestural. Next. In brushstrokes, It's also the simultaneous acknowledgement and repudiation of abstract expressionism, which was nothing if not gestural. And on the left is a painting by Lichtenstein called Brushstroke with Spatter. And on the right, a black and white photo of him working on a very large painting of brushstrokes. Why am I telling you this? Because of the pond. Next. Not Selby's koi pond, fully Lichtensteinized, to use Mike McLaughlin's technical verb, nor the conservatory pond we just saw, nor the waterfront pond, which is on the right, but Lichtenstein's and Monet's lily ponds. Next. Here, both artists give form to reflections, confounding distinctions between solid and void to an extent neither had before. Indeed, one might say of Lichtenstein, one might say reflections are the raison d'etre of his Monet-based water lilies. And I think you can see that in both of them, we have trees reflected in the pond in the bottom lower left of the Monet work in the Orangerie, and in the top screen print by Lichtenstein, you also have a tree with foliage there. And you see, particularly in the Lichtenstein, these repeated verticals that are solid planes of color, diagonals, dots. And so there's this confusion about, are those trees? Are those reflections of trees? Are they, maybe because they're white, are they clouds? What are they? Similarly, you have a lot of confusion between reflections in the grasses. In the Monet, for example, at the bottom right, or in the top towards where the tree is. Are those reflections? What are the grasses growing from beneath? So that kind of what's on the surface and what's behind or below is very unclear in both of them. So the idea of doing water lilies resurfaced for Lichtenstein when he thought he could use something called spotting or swirling. The technique enables decorative machine turning made by abrading metal, yielding both discrete and interconnected shiny swirls. Could I have the next? And when Lichtenstein first saw such swirls on the dashboards of cars from the 1920s and 30s, he thought they could look like water. And what you're seeing on the top left is a Bentley Blazer from 1930. And you have to look closely at these little sort of somewhat circular, somewhat diamond-like forms. Those are actually the metallic swirls, okay? So they're very precise and industrialized, very different from what you see in Monet's very gestural paintings. Not only could such a technique produce swirls on metal, but the precise machine-made or industrial appearance Lichtenstein wanted. He believed they'd be perfectly suited to working with Monet's water lilies, in which, as Lichtenstein says, the trees are reflected upside down, the sky at the bottom of the pond. Next, please. Donald Zaff of Zaff Tech Arts, formerly of Graphic Studio in Tampa, found an example of swirling in a photograph of Charles Lindbergh's airplane, The Spirit of St. Louis, in the Smithsonian, which he famously flew on the first solo nonstop flight from Long Island to Paris. And you can see that swirling here. Again, very, very precise, very regular, in the nose of the airplane. Zaff sent the photo to Lichtenstein and came up with a technique for swirling in the studio. And you see Zaff in conversation with Lichtenstein in the photograph on the left in the exhibition. In spite of the high-tech result of this technique, it was decidedly low-tech, a drill press and shoe rubber with a mixture of carborundum and glycerin for abrasion. By replacing the rubber slug at the base of the drill press, a crisp swirl could be repeated with equal freshness. If that sounds complicated, it is. Keep in mind that the process of laying down swirls was exhausting. They had to be done individually, one at a time on a sheet of stainless steel as large as 8 foot by 6 foot, and sometimes on enamel or another metal. And they also had to meet each time the specifications of Lichtenstein himself. The patterns and reflections made by swirls interact with the metal surfaces of the work. And here you see a Liechtenstein water lilies with clouds from the Norton collection on the left screen, and a detail. And I think you can see where that detail is in the actual screen print. So the swirls interact with the metal surfaces of the work so that the images change with the intensity or diminution of light in the actual viewing space. And you can see them if you look carefully and fascinatingly. They can see you, if you will. They're reflective. Know that the swirls can transform into rows of X's and streams of sharp darts, and that sometimes these mechanical and industrial looking screen prints become organic, a swell paradox. Next, please. It's not just that these enormous screen prints are made on metal. It's their huge scale and expansive palette that makes them pop. Here, Lichtenstein's palette expands from 4 colors to about 20. As a 19th century scholar, I appreciate that the soft pink celadon greens and subtle lilacs, which don't, by the way, show up in this digital image. So you really need to see the incredibly subtle hues of the works themselves. So these hues that Lichtenstein adds to the water lilies recall Monet's distinctive palette, although they lack the modulation of the colors in the Impressionist work. But what delights me most are the ways that both artists engage space, as Lichtenstein, the great flattener, of course, would notice. Monet's water lily paintings are not as flat looking as mine, but he was flattening them, end quote. In other words, it's hard to tell whether you're looking down from above the images in the pond or looking up from beneath the surface of the pond, as I mentioned earlier. Both artists' handling of space disorients the viewer. If Monet designed the presentation of his last water lilies so that they surround viewers, putting them in the pond, so to speak, Lichtenstein goes a step further. The enamel ground of the print, fully beswirled, actually reflects the viewer standing in front of it. As scholar Frederick Tooten puts it, the viewer, like some modern Narcissus, drops into his reflection. My favorite description of Monet's water lilies comes from art historian Leo Steinberg. I'd like to suggest that we can apply it to Lichtenstein's as well. Quote, in the water lilies, the law of gravity, that splendid projection of the human mind lodged in its body, is abrogated, end quote. Again, and this is Carol speaking, are these reflected trees, clouds, are these grasses underneath, or reflections of what hangs above? We are completely disoriented. In conclusion, despite dramatically different, even dramatically opposed styles, Lichtenstein's and Monet's series have astonishing similarities. Both have a compelling engagement with process, as well as the repetitive elements of formal structure and syntax. Next. Each evolves from an innovative style, pop and impressionist respectively. And on the left, you see, next slide. On the left, you see Lichtenstein's masterpiece, which recently sold at auction for $165 million, breaking a number of records. And on the right, Claude Monet's garden, his house at Argenteuil, the first home where he actually cultivated a garden and started painting his gardens. So each of these, one, the experiments with pop imagery on the one hand, with Lichtenstein, the rendering of light and color on the other, end up culminating in a lily pond. Could I have the next? In both, conventional ways of seeing are called into question. But when Lichtenstein enters Giverny, so do we. He, like his precursor, gives us a surprisingly immediate experience of how nature is inflected by light, season, and time of day, of the ways that form inflect seeing, and finally in the water lilies, by the incorporation of the viewer. Next. Let me give the last words to Lichtenstein and to these screen prints in our exhibition. My work isn't about form, it's about seeing. I'm excited about seeing things, and I'm interested in the way I think other people saw things. I suppose seeing at its most profound level may be synonymous with form, or rather form is the result of unified seeing. Thank you. I'm delighted to take questions. Please put them in the chat, and Jeannie Perales will moderate. But while you're thinking about what to ask, please enjoy this 1-minute walkthrough of the exhibition.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that fascinating talk. It was like being back in school with your favorite professor. Really enjoyed it, and I know that our guests did as well. If anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we have a little time here for some discussion. We're definitely getting a lot of nice comments here, Carol. Fascinating. This was wonderful. I must go back again. Thanks for this incredible overview and insight into this body of work. Love the emphasis on the practice of seeing and the sparkles. Thank you. That's wonderful. Tracing Monet's influence on Liechtenstein strengthens both of them as artists committed to visual excitement. Thank you for this fabulous lecture. Wonderful presentation. Fascinating. Can we show this to friends? Yes.
Sure. I want to say actually one thing here. Some of you who are residents of Sarasota or friends and members of the garden and who have come and seen the other shows know this. But one of the things for me about being a curator that is so amazing is that I, of course, come to these artists. I know their work as visual practitioners, But when I look at their work through the lens of flowers or plants, I see something new always in their work. And I think it's true for people who are garden lovers. They may see something new in the garden because they're looking at screen prints or paintings or whatever we have in the mansion. That cross-fertilization to me is incredibly interesting. And this was a particularly interesting show to do because I've never signed off on an installation remotely. I'm here in Southern California, in case people don't know that. I really had to spend a lot of time making sure I understood swirling, which in a way you really do have to be there. I mean, I finally figured it out from reproductions and from Zooming with Jeannie Perales and Laura Avery in the galleries. But I think that's an interesting thing, that there are these subtleties, even though Lichtenstein is a big, bold maker, and you get the image right away. It is so refined what he's doing with all his different silk screening sophistication. So that's something that I love about the show. And of course, I love the zaniness in the conservatory and in the gardens of putting these things together. Somebody who is as gestural an artist and somebody who is so willfully industrialized. It's great. So I'll stop there and see if there's some questions. Did Liechtenstein ever face lawsuits? I don't know. There's some people, however, who are attending this chat who would know better than I do. I didn't come across that in my reading. I did come across it quite a bit with Warhol, I must say, when I did that exhibition. So if anybody has an answer to that, anybody from the institutions that owns Liechtenstein's, that would be great to know. I'm sorry I don't have the answer to that question.
We're getting a couple questions here about why Selby Gardens picked Roy Lichtenstein. Do you want to speak to that, Carol?
Well, I think it was, as is so often the case, who does flowers? And it's also, it's often incredibly surprising because, when we thought about Warhol, I knew, and many people do, but not that many people know that Warhol did 10,000 images of flowers. I don't think that many people associate Liechtenstein with flowers. So one of the things we have to do, or we do, when thinking about whom we might present, is think about, are there any artists who would be interesting to look at who actually do flowers? And I think that in every show we've done, we've shown that flowers is an incredibly interesting lens through which to look at the work. And that started with Chagall, and it went to Warhol and Gauguin and Dali. And if you think about it, I'm not sure that any of those is necessarily somebody. They're not flower painters at all. And we kind of, not that we would mind doing flower painters, and if we could do somebody like Rachel Reusch, from the Baroque period, we'd be thrilled. But it's not clear anybody can get Rachel Reusch. So if you have one, please let us know. But just to say that Liechtenstein was in this group, and we were incredibly excited And it was actually Jennifer Romanecki who said, oh, you know, I've seen a very big one of these. We liked that they were huge. You know, the one from the Perez is like about 8 feet. And all of the screen prints that we have are very large. And we like that idea. Obviously, Lichtenstein was great because he did Monet, and that meant that the garden could do Monet, so that the garden and the conservatory are this mix of both of those artists. And the horticulture team worked really, really hard researching Monet's gardens, both the flower gardens and the water gardens, and putting that together with Liechtenstein. So it made Liechtenstein completely perfect. And I kind of have always liked, as a curator, the kind of unlikely artist. And Liechtenstein is an unlikely guy for a garden. Let's just face it. So we thought that was a good thing. But it was really the Monet Liechtenstein thing that cinched it. So thank you for that question. I hope I answered it.
I echo Carol's sentiments that that this particular show, the concept of it really came from our boss, Jennifer Romanecki, who loved Liechtenstein and studied modern art in college herself. So she came up with the idea, and we thought it was a really fun one, and that it would apply really beautifully to the gardens, especially who could argue with Giverny, which is, you know, one of the most beloved gardens in the world. So lots more questions and comments here. I think you're getting a lot of prior students, Carol, who are enjoying listening to one of your lectures again. This is an interesting question here from Brian Martin from Williams College. He said, might you speak about how Liechtenstein work is in futurist dialogue with our digital pixelated internet technological world amid the internet, smartphones, computer technologies, Zoom and all?
That's a great question. Brian Martin is my colleague in the French department, and you know, a beloved conspirator in all things French with me, clearly he anticipated that. You know, his regular dots derived from a commercial technique of printing, so prefigure pixelation. I think this has even been mentioned in some of the Liechtenstein scholarship. There's also that kind of way in which you can say there's this wonderful paradox between, you know, on the one hand, a painting by Liechtenstein that sells for $165 million, masterpiece, and the fact that he is really trying to give us a sort of more democratic art form that exists in multiples and that appeals to an audience through its emphasis on the popular and the everyday, which is, of course, a larger goal of pop. So it would be fascinating. I mean, Liechtenstein lived into the late 90s, so he certainly was aware of how his work was linked, or in a way foresaw, if you will, the explosion of digital imagery. But I think, you know, in a way, it's so interesting to think of somebody who works in so many different mediums as well, so that he's populating the landscape, even a little bit humorously. I mean, you know, I don't know that he expected everybody to be wearing his Untitled shirt, which, you know, when artists in early 20th century Russia were designing clothing or designing teacups. I mean, there was a little bit that idea that it would expand to the masses, but there's this constant way in which accessibility, and obviously when he got very famous, inaccessibility, they're right butting heads against each other. But yes, I mean, I think he understood, as somebody who was a master technician, I think he understood where a lot of these things might go, let's just say. Thanks for that.
Great. Carol, we have an interesting question here. It says, this may sound blunt, but what makes Lichtenstein's work so amazing? To me, it seems like very simple work that many college art students could easily replicate.
Well, I've had this kind of question before, and I understand the question, because it is an art that looks deceptively simple. It's meant to look simple. It's highly repetitive. And yet, I think if you look back over Lichtenstein's career, you see that it is enormously varied. That I really think, and possibly some people who are colleagues in printmaking processes, I think they would probably bear me out here, that Lichtenstein is such an innovative craftsperson, and that the things that he did, I mean, you talk about swirling. He had wanted to make Monet's water lilies since like 1968. He only found a way to do that with a team of printmakers, with a studio of printmakers in 1992, 93. So actually what he does looks very simple, and it's not. I mean, you look at that swirling process, and and the way that it's sandwiched in between so many other kinds of things, different stencils, different screen prints that are laid on top of one another. I don't think it's simple at all, actually. He's really extremely skillful in his technique, but it's more than that. It's the conceptual thing. Sure, many people can imitate Lichtenstein, but Lichtenstein did it first. And I would say that it takes a slow read of Lichtenstein, by which I mean from the very early 1960s on, to see how complex the work actually is. So people are always going to, I think, be somewhat in the grip of a kind of way of thinking that somehow the artist's hand is the litmus test of real creativity. And as I raised that question in my talk, I think that is highly, highly questionable. And we think about artists who have redefined the history of art, like Mondrian, for example, and then the whole pop movement after that. You know, there are just many, many instances in which, yes, it might look simple. It's the idea. And that goes back to, you know, somebody like Marcel Duchamp, the conceptual. So I hope that answers it. I would love to have a long discussion with you about it.
I love that question because I think it's one that we get a lot. And I think that when we do these shows, I know that as a team, we all gain a whole new appreciation for the cleverness, the complexity, the intelligence behind the work. And this one is just like, I mean, it's been incredible. And when you see the water lilies, especially, they're very complex compositions, and you realize the kind of talent and vision that went into creating them.
Yeah, it's really great that you can take it in one swoop, but that's not really what the work's about. You really need to go quite a bit further. Yeah. Thank
we
you.
have another question here from Gail White asking about the size of Liechtenstein's editions in number.
Oh, they vary quite a bit. I'm not a print expert. But there's a range of them, to be sure. I don't have the exact figures for you. If somebody does, please put that in the chat. It's interesting. I'm not a Liechtenstein scholar, although I've done a lot of work in the 20th century. So there are areas where I'm grayer than others. Also, I was working, unfortunately, under the pandemic without access to the Catalogue raisonné, which would have given me that answer in an eye blink, the blink of an eye, if you will. I just couldn't get that in my grasp in this time. I only saw it in New York way before we even procured the loans for the show. But thanks for the question. His series vary in number. I don't think he had a fixed number. And some of them he worked on for a very, very long period of time. In fact, there have been whole exhibitions, very large exhibitions, of an entire series by Liechtenstein. I'm thinking of the show of the entablatures that just closed last year at the Whitney Museum of Art. And the variation, that's what's really great. If you see a huge span of the work, as you could in that show, you can see how inventive he actually is, because there's so many and they're so different. Thanks for the question.
And I understand that in the Water Lilies, which was done in 1992, so it was just 5 years before he passed away, there were not very many created. So I believe that his editions became less, in more recent years. This is
yes, and one of the things I love, if I might just point out, is that as a result, really Liechtenstein's Water Lilies, as Monet's Water Lilies, are really one of their last great bodies of work, certainly Monet's last great body of work, and very definitely one of Liechtenstein's. And I think that gives them a certain resonance that is very moving too.
I agree. We're getting an interesting question here from Radia, who said, seems like Roy Lichtenstein gave his entire existence to breaking down ideas and place the work above anything else. That's a different approach to life and art that students are not yet achieving. Nothing simple here. He's a very clever person, very complex thinker.
Thank you for that. I think it's actually pretty interesting to look at Lichtenstein for a long time. And actually, he worked not even from Monet's paintings. He worked from photographs of Monet's paintings. So that's just really great. Like, just take it as far away from the original, any original. So not working from nature per se in this body of work, not working from Monet's paintings in this body of work, working from reproductions. And yet, I really keep being astounded by how much of nature he captures. Not that they look natural, but nature's all in there. And all of Monet is definitely in there. And that interesting thing that he does with the haystacks, we have that screaming double haystack, which is yellow in the show, both yellow, And we have some of the reds and blues, but you get this sense of time of day that he's contributing to the series, that he's willfully putting in the series by giving us this information. Just what the eye sees, the movement from yellow to yellow and red, to red with blue, and blue to black. I mean, he gives us all of that. We see it. And then he tells us, you know, in his interviews, of which there are many, that that's what this means. So he kind of comes in through the back door. And it is true that I think he's always thinking about making a unified whole on whatever ground he chooses, be it paper, be it canvas, be it metal. That's what interests him, is creating a world there, a believable world there. Yeah. Thanks for that comment.
Well, I think that our questions have come to a conclusion here, and I think that people seem to really enjoy it. One question we received is, how long is the show up? And I can tell you, it's up to June 27th. So we do hope that you will make it in person, and bring your friends and come back many times. And there are other programs, other lectures we have slated, and classes, and of course our Lichtenstein nights, where you can enjoy performances here in relation to the exhibition. And it's just a joy to see people here enjoying the gardens and visiting the exhibition and bringing their friends and family.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Team Selby. I'm always so grateful. And one of the things that is rather extraordinary for an art historian to say is that I, who know the artworks, you know, I've always seen the works by artists beforehand. I just am always completely electrified by what I see in the gardens and the conservatory. And of course, for those who have not yet been here, the sighting of Selby Gardens is part of its magic. And so I hope that in the wake of the pandemic, many of you will be able to come who perhaps are not ready quite yet to come. So thank you again, and enjoy the exhibition. Keep well.
Thank you so much, Carol. It was just wonderful. Brava.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
And thank you all for tuning in. This has been recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all of the registrants, and feel free to share it broadly. We want to share Carol's pearls of wisdom as far as we can. So thank you all. Take good care, and until next time.
Thanks.